Hello, my name is Alex and welcome to Oogle. So the title itself is kind of a contradiction. It's an opinion on a game that I tell you I already love. But in this series that I'm literally making for nobody because nobody watches this channel, I'm going to dig deep and spill my heart as to why I love it. The series has 3 parts. I will learn a significant amount about the game and the people behind it. I will play through the game and record a full playthrough so that I have my own footage. And I'm going to put my heart on my sleeve and describe the emotional impact and creative impact that the game had on me. This last condition has many subsections. It's kind of like an umbrella condition that I'll get into later. But first, I want to take a moment and explain why I feel it necessary to do this at all. At the most basic level, this is me, a gamer of 15 years, stepping back and realizing that a video game that resonates in one's mind is not simply images on a screen dictated by your fingers on a controller. This is moving art. These are the stories that we always wish to be a part of. This is the closest we get to entering the perspectives of these characters in a unique world unlike the mundane world we live in. This is the illusion of control and power within an environment that lets our basic humanness thrive so that we may forget our sins, and our commitments, our woes, etc. Oh, and our collective detest for the futures of our civilization. On the most basic level, this is me stepping back and appreciating the outlet of an interactive story that transcends what we see in Control. There are many video games that have done this for me in my life, the games that force us into a specific world with their rules and their adventures, and open doors within my mind to create new ones. The games that force us to take their template and paint our creativity upon their canvas, so that we could shift the perspectives on our already culturally important narratives. This is me experiencing the collective effort of a passionate group who work intensely to create an outlet for us, and create opportunities for us without even realizing it. So I feel it important to address the nature of the video game, a term that's been really saturated within the medium of YouTube to the point of semantic satiation. I believe we have lost sight of what a video game does for us emotionally and developmentally, so by making this video and hopefully more of its kind, I'll shed light into an awareness that's now mostly marginalized by the simplicity of pressing buttons on a controller. The first game in this series is the now defunct Lionhead Studios' Fable III. Created by Titan game designer Peter Molyneux, the BAFTA Fellowship-winning Brit who created games like Black and White, Populous, and Syndicate. This is a man who had one idea and followed it through by employing an all-star voice cast to convey those moments of humor and industrialized fantastical wit. Actors like Michael Fassbender, Jonathan Ross, and Stephen Fry used their voices to add layers of almost campy villainy to the story, while the friendlier compatriots like Bernard Hill, Simon Pegg, John Cleese, and Ben Kingsley awarded the player with a more direct connection to the revolution that we desired to establish within Albion. These were some of the voices that carried us through this journey, and, on a more personal level, these were the voices that would unlock something in my mind which offered me avenues of pure creativity within the scope of the fantasy narrative. For those of you who don't know, Fable 3 is set in Albion 50 years after the events of Fable 2. The hero of Albion has died and left the kingdom to his eldest son, Logan. The story really centers around the idea of a revolution as it throws the player immediately into the fire with decisions that affect the kingdom. We are revolting against Logan, who makes unbelievably difficult and oppressive decisions for the kingdom. The scent of revolt is fueled by Logan's supposed madness, but we later find out that his decisions were not entirely devoid of reason. During a journey that leads us to Aurora, we find out that there is a Stygian force headed for Albion known as the Darkness, led by the Crawler. Logan tells us that Teresa, the Blind Seer, had made it known to him at the beginning of his reign. After the Revolution narrative, the hero enters the Kingship narrative, in which the player directly oversees the policies of Albion, conferring with the people to whom he made promises, and the amoral Reaver who continued his devout capitalist fight for the financial betterment of the royal treasury. However, this kingship is soured by the looming fact of the Dark Apocalypse coming in a remarkably prescient calculation of 1 year from the coronation. The hero can still play the normal game and ignore the main quests, but the only real way to progress is to tackle quests dictated on the royal ledger. After a series of random time jumps and bouts of fiscal judgments, we finally face the darkness and become the hero of Albion once again. Now, that's a very reductive summary of the game. It's so brief because the point of this video is not centered around the narrative per se, but rather how this specific fantasy narrative embedded a niche perspective of storytelling into my mind in the following years of me playing the game. So let's break it down. A land unlike my own. Let me begin this inward journey by stating that I did not play many games apart from the GameCube games my cousin gave me when I was in my preteens. The Xbox 360 was the second console I ever received, and with it came Fable 3. Albion is the first visual, fantastical landscape I've ever been exposed to within the realm of gaming. Naturally, my attachment to this game stems from the fact that the idea of open-world gaming was something I could never dream of, till I experienced it with Fable 3. Because of its age, the map size does not even compare to the more modern open-world games like The Witcher 3 or any of the Assassin's Creed games. However, the entire game map was large enough to house some of the most lush and lively cities, forests, deserts. This is what I call the land unlike my own, the overarching physical setting for stories I would write in my early teens. I would write my characters within the forests of the Dwellers, or the valleys of Mist Peak. I was drawn to the idea of the lone wanderer who hallucinates these images of apocalyptic despair through the dunes of the Auroran Desert. These are the lands unlike our perception of reality within the restrictive environment of Earth. Why restrictive? Isn't reality often stranger than fiction? It was when I was younger until I entered the world of never-ending mundanity, with its routines that promise us a plethora of paths should we choose to follow them. I'm talking about the ordinary American path that ultimately leads to death after working for 50 years plus. Well, that isn't very strange, besides the point that humans are complacent within that system. A guaranteed life of hardships, yes, but not the hardships that grow the soul. Not the type of suffering that leads to personal salvation. Do I dare make a profound statement about Fable? It's certainly not a complete enough world to substitute reality and the responsibilities I have within it. So why do I deem it so worthy to be the land unlike my own? Well, I'm not sure I can fully understand why, but I can attempt to tackle it. After all, growth, to me, begins with the expansion of the mind, and the discovery and absorption of different perspectives. To me, Fable was the beginning of discovery, the beginning of the realization that there are many others out there who depend upon the exploration and the creation of other worlds to simply stay alive. It is that dependence which has beautifully affected me, and kept me from leaving this world entirely. When I traveled to the absolute lowest point within myself, I traveled to the marshlands of Morningwood, or the charming little hamlet of Brightwall, and I decided to stick around within these realms of joyful simplicity. When I lost all the power to control my earthly surroundings, I cast my spells against the Hollow Men, the Hobbs, the human enemies, and felt like I had an actual journey which involved control and order, and chaos that could be organized if I just acted the right way or stabbed the right thing. What a grand illusion of our time, though. The ability to not only read about the roles of the heroes who must fight a type of evil, but to insert ourselves into the narrative and be the person to destroy the evil and make human decisions along the way. It is the land unlike my own because I cannot do this within my reality. I cannot face the evils of our time and make a difference. I cannot do much about saving our planet from certain human destruction. I cannot stop rich conservatives from making profits off people's suffering, and I cannot stop lazy liberals from learning that taking away people's speech is the tyranny that they fear. I cannot feed the hungry masses or pay the poor. I can only succumb to the terror of the world, the terror of the individual. That is the individual who is helpless and must continue on a journey of self-discovery before he or she could possibly help others with theirs. The morality of Albion. This is where I could sound like a humanitarian or a sociopath, but that's the joy of it. In Albion, you are constantly evaluating your socio-political status as well as your morality. Your choices throughout the game will ultimately leave you with angel wings that represent goodness or demon wings which represent evil. In our reality, this is also the case, unless we are devilishly covert about our mischief or humbly subtle about our acts of good deeds. This is not the case in Fable 3, as your decisions force you to be honest, or rather there is no covert methods to executing these decisions as there would be in reality. However, there is a simultaneity within the game that I can't seem to turn a blind eye to. The fact that there is seldom a middle ground to be found within the game. It's simply operating on both extremes of goodness and evil. You either promise something or you don't. You either make a good choice or a bad one, and yes, obviously those choices add up to a complete moral overview towards the end, but that is a completely bastardized version of reality. And that's okay, there's nothing wrong with this, because that type of morality is exactly the simplicity I needed to explore when the more nuanced, realistic decisions encumbered me every day. Speaking more to the extremes, we see characters of innate capitalistic evilness in Reaver, who during your reign as king puts monetary value at the forefront and disregards the populace. Then there is the Crawler, who is the representation of evil incarnate and darkness as a plague to purify Albion from its weak and worthless creatures. We also see characters of goodness like Walter, Paige, Jasper, who ultimately want a prosperous future for Albion. Now, the morality throughout the game, as I've said, is rather one-dimensional. However, the characters and their lives within the game represent a more realistic, human perspective that I feel the game lacks with respect to the overall story arc. At the end of the game, the morality is solely boiled down to money. If the player wants to keep their promises to the Dwellers, the Aurorans, to Samuel, to Paige, etc., they will need a considerable amount of wealth, which is itself a realism that we face in the world today. In a capitalist society, more often than not, wanting to be moral gets in the way of profit or individual wealth. Within the game's monarchy, this individual wealth turns into the wealth of the royal treasury. However, the player has the option to donate their personal gold to the treasury. Which is what I did because for some reason I feel bad being evil in video games. There is an odd intermingling of reality and downright impracticality, but it ultimately is a simplicity I've returned to time and time again, specifically because the game operates outside the normal conventions of reality. Parallels, people, and industrial comedy. This title is certainly a hard one to quantify, solely because the people of Albion represent realistic depictions of the proletariat masses, yet still somehow turn out to be caricatures of them as well. For example, Brightwall seems to be the village of the middle to upper middle class, yet they still suffer under the financial restrictions of Logan's reign. In the Dweller camp, the villagers are all down on their luck and they make it shown, unless of course the player interacts with them and changes their moods. The parallels here are those of the financial tethers to collective emotions. It is almost impossible to be blind to the correlation between money and happiness. Another thing to notice is the correlation between the people's humor and a society's financial fluctuations. The less money in a middle-class community, the higher the humor comes to the forefront of public human characteristics. So, the humor we see from the citizens of Brightwall are that of dark sarcasm that originates at the point of Logan's fiscal policies. I can't speak much to private humor because we seldom see that in the game, but this correlation mimics reality, at least from my current perception of the world. There are few personal merriments in our lives that help us cope with financial instability, but humor is one of those. We can control humor, its content, the timing, and our actions among a crowd who will give you the benefit of reaction. Usually the funniest people in life are those who've lived through constant hardships. We see the evolution, rather the emergence of humor within a middle-class society in Fable 3 during Logan's reign. Post Logan's reign, the humor continues because A, it's simply programmed to do so, and B, because once humor is discovered, it is implemented within human habits as a producer of feel-good biological chemicals. That is, once you realize you're funny, you feel good making people laugh and you keep fucking doing it. This obviously does not necessarily mean this behavior is an absolute. There are more strictly toned societies in our real world that promote strict behavior that follows a certain standard and marginalizes the useless form of the joke. And there are opposite cultures. Buddhists believe that there are only two forms of language that matter, poetry and jokes. This take could merely be a perception issue as well. Why do we constantly see people of the Industrial Revolution or the Great Depression depicted as homeless and sorrowful humans with no future to be seen in the horizon? The Industrial Revolution provided the human population with a means for accessible goods, but at the cost of horrific working conditions and low pay. People of the Great Depression simply lacked the means to provide because of obscene financial decisions from the powers that be. We never learned about their humor in the history books, but I'd bet a considerable amount of money that it was dark, sarcastic, doom-driven hilarity. At the same time, it probably isn't important to discuss the humor because we read the humor within the great novels or poems of the respective era. Why are the people of Fable a parallel to realistic society? Because their humor, a fundamentally human trait, is a reaction of the time they lived in, and it drives their will to live when a future seems grim or impossible. Transcending the controls, the lifeblood of my limited creativity. I mentioned earlier about the expansion, or rather the emergence of my creativity, as I imagined myself writing stories within the world of Albion. The doors this game opened for me were the doors of perception. Over time, I've been able to craft new worlds, but more importantly, I've been able to write human characters within that world and have them react to unique situations in it. And my storytelling did not stop solely in the fictional. In university, trying to be perceptive and aware of the infinite amount of perceptions and interpretations of human thought allowed me to write essays on various works of poetry and novels through a lens that picks apart the language that makes us human. For example, I wrote an essay on Wallace Stevens' Notes Toward a Supreme Fiction, where he tells us what the supreme fiction is and its requisites. Very long story short, Stevens believed that the supreme fiction was the great story of Earth. We already have the great stories of heaven and hell, as dictated by Dante, but there has never been the great story of Earth. My essay tackled the nature of creating such a fiction. This is an example of a very niche perspective on a topic written 50 years ago. What is the great story of Earth, with its vast history, its fluctuating cultures, its tethers to the supernatural in order to stay grounded to reality and make meaning out of nothing? What if this story is not to be written by us at all, but by a conscious mind not of this world? Think about this. We wrote the stories of heaven and hell, yet we know nothing of heaven and hell. If it exists, if there is even a semblance of cosmic evidence that it inhabits a place within a dimension we can't fathom. To write the great story of Earth, it would either have to be written by the collective species of Earth as it progresses through its infancy, its suffering, and its holistic enlightenment toward a future devoid of bigotry, ignorance, and adherence to unknown influences, or it must be written by the unknown itself, perhaps the dead that inhabit heaven or hell. Just as we from Earth wrote of the unknown places wrote of Earth. Now this argument is completely and utterly devoid of scientific fact, but this is where my creativity allowed me to write an essay specifically on a perspective that would only make sense in the poetic. But it doesn't have to be filled with scientific minutiae, because it is a philosophy that can allow us to think about the whole of human nature and maybe allow us to progress as a species and to disregard the attachments that keep us from progressing. I'm thinking religion, exploitation, personal wealth, hoarding of resources, etc. Basically the things that have kept half of our human race downtrodden and the other half blooming. Transcending the controls does not necessarily mean that I ended up in a place of fictional creativity. What it does mean is that I am evolving constantly. As asymptotic as my journey might be, that is, attempting to absorb all perceptions of humanity, it's a journey I'm happy to continue if it means I can better the world in my own small way. Fable 3 helped me develop my own philosophy on the world, by introducing me to a completely foreign world and helping me realize that everything is connected yet so detached at the same time. I guess the entire point I'm trying to make by commenting on a video game that's almost 10 years old is that the video game is not and should not be a mind-numbing endeavor. On the contrary, it should open one's mind to the possibilities of the unknown, to take notice of the foreign lands within our world, and to realize that these foreign lands are not unlike ours, and they should be treated with dignity, respect, and the undeterminable number of enigmas that this earth has to offer. As I've shared with you my personal journey of creativity, I hope others start to see the video game in a slightly different light. It is a work of moving art that can teach us something. Thank you for reading, watching, or listening to me.
You have done for them. We are proud to be part of Albion. I shall return to Aurora in the knowledge that we may at last enjoy peace. Farewell, Your Majesty.
Walter was right about you. You're a hero in every sense of the word. The hero Albion needed.
What will you do now?
I will continue to serve you the best way I can. I belong down in the city. The people there will always need help. Goodbye, my king.
You have done what I thought impossible. You are the ruler I could never be. But you don't need me anymore. And Albion will heal easier without me.
Well, King, old chum, ruler supreme, pal, you did it. You saved the kingdom. and it's my turn to say goodbye. I'm not cut out to be a general. Now, I think I'd like to start travelling again. Or maybe see if Paige needs any help down in Industrial. But before I go, let's send off our friend in style, shall we? This one's for you, Walter.
This is the world as it could have been, devoid of color, devoid of life. It is thanks to you that it isn't so, and you did it without becoming a tyrant. The people love you, and you have banished the shadow of your brother's reign. You kept your promise to Sabine and his people, when it would have been easier to turn your back on them. A noble gesture. You swore an oath to Paige to better the lives of your people. And you did so, even in the face of great danger. You did for the Aurorans what your brother would not. He broke his promise, but you proved to be the better leader. Without the strength to make those choices, we would not be standing here now. Perhaps we shall meet again one day, King.
Aren't you going to tell me my future?
The future will reveal itself when it is ready to do so.